And welcome to the Geospatial Forum. Great to see all the conversations and camaraderie going. Welcome. I'm Ross Mintermeyer, Director of the Center for Geospatial Analytics, and I'm thrilled to host today's speaker, Dr. Bethany Cutts. Dr. Cutts is a faculty fellow of the center and an assistant professor in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. And this is her second year on the faculty at NC State after being recruited from the University of Illinois, where she was for a couple of years or so. Hotly recruited. Dr. Cutts graduated with a bachelor's degree in environmental biology from Colgate University, and then later went on to receive a PhD from the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. But as I understand, make no mistake, she really studied to be doing environmental social science there in GIS. And then went on to do really cool work with Mark LaBelle at UC Davis and other things. Dr. Cutts' research identifies science-driven solutions to enhance social, economic, and ecological well-being of communities, often through collaborations that bring together urban planners, ecologists, engineers, geospatial scientists, etc. And today, Dr. Cutts will be highlighting a few of her exciting projects, including Bridge, building resilience through innovation and diverse engagement, a long-term recovery of communities after Hurricane Matthew, and the fascinating concept of thinking about foreclosure as a type of landscape change. So today her forum is disappearing gardens, remediated rivers, dead grass, and comparing qualitative, participatory, and conventional approaches toward better integration of environmental justice and sustainability. What happened to the spatial methods? They got changed in there. All right, well, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bethany Cutts.
So thanks everybody for making it out here. It was a very long trip down the hall for me to get here. I was very uncertain if I would make it in time, so I'm glad it all came together. But I'm excited today to talk about what for Halloween might be considered kind of zombie sustainability projects. And I'm still trying to figure out if I'm committed to that metaphor, but the idea that when we look at certain aspects of urban landform, and we think of it conventionally as a good thing from a sustainability perspective, but to really understand it and kind of look at whether it perpetuates or perhaps invents new environmental injustices. So thinking about these kind of everyday environmental injustices as the undead of sustainability initiatives. It's a little weak, but I'm working on it. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about different approaches to spatializing data in order to understand how environmental justice can fit into sustainability. If you've been to other geospatial, in the geospatial seminar series, might look a little bit different. The most recent map I made used these high-tech tools, colored pencils, and a printout. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this project, which focused in New Mexico, but I am going to start by talking about my interest since coming here in studying long-term recovery from hurricanes and thinking about the ideas we can draw from environmental justice literature in order to understand what happens under these severe and often intense periods of reorganization when lots of times the communities that are most impacted by the disruption are those that are experiencing other forms of environmental injustice or disproportionate burdens and proximity to hazards in the first place. So as background, environmental justice as a way of thinking is a little bit different from some fields of scholarship in that it has a very close tie to activism and a movement toward environmental justice. So many of the roots of the movement are in North Carolina around Warren County and the siting of a industrial waste facility in Warren County in a predominantly black area, as well as other similar struggles across the United States where kind of at the fringes of civil rights, environmentalism, anti-toxics, and labor movements, people were finding that, environmental protection as it was originally formed wasn't really for all, and that there was really a need to think about environmental harms and how to prevent them, and because they were so poorly distributed through society. So histories of overtly racist practices, including slavery, but also overtly racist zoning practices, had led to the co-location of marginalized communities and these environmental toxins that were polluting air, water, and other resources. Now, the scholarship has strong spatial roots. So some of the early work comes from the analysis of the proportions of African American and other minority communities at a county level and the number of toxic facilities. And that analysis really set the stage for this integration of research and activism or praxis of environmental justice. So that's not to say that the research itself is inherently biased, but it's asking questions with the normative goal of changing a system that has made that has privileged kind of white bodies, white spaces in ways that, and degraded the spaces, bodies, and ideologies of those who don't associate with that group. As environmental justice, as scholarship has evolved, it's opened up lots of different kind of questions about the accuracy and adequacy of these initial spatial analytic methods. People have gone on to develop more sophisticated spatial analysis methods, but also to really recognize that environmental justice is not only about adjacency, that there are lots of other dimensions to environmental injustices, especially when we start to think about things like climate change. We have non-adjacent but highly connected spaces we need to think about. We have transnational issues with waste being transported from highly consumptive countries like the United States to other places where rules, regulations, and economic development might create a coercive set of factors that encourage people to accept waste and therefore kind of degrade the environment there. So in thinking about these things with respect to sustainability, we have an opportunity here in environmental justice to address what is sometimes seen in the literature as an equity deficit in that sustainability model. So there has this sustainability policy and management decisions often unintentionally start with the assumption that everything is more or less equal or equivalent, and so that social dimension in most studies is undervalued because it's not as easily translated into economic terms as, say, an ecosystem service model. We see this lots of times, right? Even within ecosystem services, the cultural elements are most difficult to quantify and incorporate. So to really get to change, either through incremental methods or more radical transitions, we need to really think about what are the systems that are in place that are producing environmental injustices, and how do we connect opportunities at multiple scales in order to affect change that addresses environmental protection for all, economic opportunity for all, and self-fulfillment for all. So I'm going to tell this in 3 stories. The first story is about the case of the disappearing garden. So this story starts out, and it uses spatial approaches that are based in historical and qualitative GIS. So we start from the position of the Ron Mandela Memorial Garden. It's founded in the late 1960s on ground owned by the state of California in Sacramento, just outside of the capital. A radical group of students start cultivating. They work together with local partners. Pretty soon, The garden is a site within the city where you've got social service agencies kind of working alongside local residents and politicians, really providing a service to the city and filling in a safe place and eyes on parks nearby where some criminal activity is going on. By the time the early 2000s roll around, land prices are high. The state has tried many times to displace the garden, but they've met resistance with the city. And the state's relationship with the city, as in any capital city, I would guess, is a little bit tense because the state owns so much property in the city and is developing it for the purposes of the state, but not necessarily the residents there. So at first glance, this really looks like a classic environmental injustice case. The gardeners struggle against the state. They're on the side of providing these ecosystem services. They have bat houses. There's green space. There's fruits. There's vegetables for residents. They're giving them to homeless shelters. And this narrative for the right to the city and a fight for environmental justice seems more or less on their side. But over time, the idea of soil contamination comes into play. And this idea about elevated soil lead in the Mandela Garden destabilizes its image as a health-promoting land use. So that soil that had been seen as a source of food and the site of the garden for healthy bodies and healthy community is reframed as polluted and dangerous. And this is one of the tactics that the agency is ultimately able to use to displace the gardeners from their site. But the story doesn't really end there because they later put a garden back on the same site using much of the same soil. So we use a number of different historical methods to understand how we got from that garden to this one in the very same location. So the first thing I did was, it's actually the idea of an undergraduate intern. She said, "Dr. Cutts, I'm taking a GIS class. Can I make a map for this project?" And I said, "Yes, Digi, you can. Whatever you want." So we had been coding out the different locations related to soil and lead that were being mentioned in articles published in the Sacramento Bee, the local newspaper, in order to better understand our contemporary project, which was about garden installs in home spaces that I'm not going to have a chance to talk about. So we really discovered the intensity with which people had been discussing the controversy over this garden, not just during the period of, especially during this period when it was being actively contested in the early 2000s, but even much earlier and much later. And so through the work that Danchi did, she picked up on a couple of different things that allowed us to do a deeper analysis. The first was that there are multiple naming strategies going on through time, and that gardens with specific names were moving around the city. So it was good to know ahead of time that there's the Mandela Garden and changed names several times, and then there was another garden next to it that that's name was repurposed in the replacement garden put in after the Mandela Garden was destroyed. So looking through this, we could spatialize it to find out kind of where attention around lead in gardens, how it was and how it was distributed through the city of Sacramento, and locate the direct players in this Mandela Garden case. We could also use that as a way to go back through other forms of records. So I spent a long time in Sac State's archive, where they had a detailed case compiled by the gardeners themselves. And then California has a really good open government policies, so I was able to get lots of meeting agendas and reports from environmental consultants about lead concentrations in different soils. And what we see is with the introduction of proposals to physically move dirt from the garden to replacement garden sites, and the introduction of lead testing on these different sites. Initially the failure to test the replacement site and the subsequent finding of high lead levels there Secondarily, the finding of an alternative replacement site, the testing there, and the remediation process, and ultimately testing on the Mandela Garden as a way to displace the gardeners. We see the politicization of what we would think of as relatively inert biophysical information, right? Soil lead levels are immutable, like if it's there, it's there. But it turns out the story is not that simple. You can measure it lots of different ways, and you can decide to report out your concern for soil safety by focusing on the average or the maxima. And we see both of those things shift in concert with the politics of the garden over time. We also see the struggle. So the other thing I think sustainability sometimes forgets to mention is that struggle is important. And environmental justice is all about the struggle. So by using an environmental justice lens, we concentrate on the struggle and we see, like, okay, so the gardeners are gone here, their community is missing, but there's equivalent garden space available to residents in the downtown corridor. There's also the institution of a, get ready for it, PRTM folks, a parks management strategic plan that incorporates community gardens for the first time and has really at that standards for soil lead concentrations that at that time are more protective than the state of California standards. So there's loss and there's gain at the same time. And we can critique this idea through super arcane geographic theories of scale, which we did in this paper. But we can also think about it in this larger context about the value of kind of thinking about spatial information and its power and ways to spatialize knowledge that isn't necessarily captured by census data or other easily accessible large data sets. I also got to use the Wayback Machine to look at old websites. So those lessons about environmental justice and its integration with sustainability kind of paid forward to this next project, which focuses on remediation along waterways. So we see a lot of times, especially in kind of post-industrial Rust Belt cities, but really across the U.S. anyway, a return to waterfront. So for a while they were the pipeline, right, leading away from the cities, and now they are areas where people are looking to invest in economic development and provide recreational opportunities. So again, stream remediation sounds like a great thing. And it is. It does a lot, but the thing is, environmental groups are not always very diverse in their own makeup. And so there are potential drawbacks to that, and one might be, even if you have very good intentions, you essentialize or tokenize socially vulnerable groups and misidentify and misrecognize their interest in your issue or the reasons they may not be engaging. So we wanted to start from the premise that people have imperfect and incomplete knowledge and test to see what forms of social vulnerability people were identifying locally. We found that there were 5 different definitions among people we interviewed that were being used, and they all had a lot in common with kind of professional geographer definitions of social vulnerability, but operationalized it in different ways for their watershed. So the first definition focused on geographic and demographic factors, so how communities defined by race, ethnicity, class were organized across the landscape. That's the way we identify vulnerable areas a lot in large-scale geospatial studies. But there also was this temporal dimension that still was focused on demographic differences, but was drawing from the history of the city to explain why, wherever you live in Milwaukee, if you are an African-American resident, you may be experiencing particular forms of social vulnerability, or a Latino resident, or an elderly resident. So this temporal component was something we don't always see in the literature that focuses on these spatial analytics. The other thing we saw was this idea of persistent vulnerability. So particular neighborhoods that were marginalized or vulnerable or almost in a kind of vulnerability trap, increasing vulnerability, so areas becoming more perceived as more vulnerable or less engaged and included in political processes over time. And then finally a transient vulnerability, which wasn't really about people at all, but about changes in people that were rapidly occurring, and the people that identified that definition were really focused on just a lack of place history and institutional knowledge. So from the perspective of understanding how watershed planners and managers could better account for social vulnerability, we found that evidence that they were limited in their definitions in comparison to the broader definitions at play locally. So these bolded definitions, temporal and persistent social vulnerability, weren't identified among the watershed professionals. So that's kind of like a blind spot for even well-intentioned people interested in sustainability that includes justice in it. The other thing we found was that the things people were mentioning were very consistent with the underlying framework for the Social Vulnerability Index developed by Susan Cutter and others in the environmental hazards literature. So we thought we could use this as a basis for a tool to help watershed planners think about vulnerability and do thought experiments about how their interventions might be perceived differently because people are thinking differently. So the Social Vulnerability Index uses a lot of built environmental characteristics and social variables to combines them in a principal components analysis at a county level, and then partitions that out into relative levels of vulnerability. So Milwaukee as a whole is very vulnerable. We could do that same thing using standardized, disaggregating the index to the census tract levels and limiting the scope of our study to the watershed boundaries to look at social vulnerability relative to other areas under local control. And then look at how populations move around by comparing data across multiple decades. So the Geolytics database standardizes census data to the same census boundaries, which just saves a pre-processing step for everybody on my end. And then we thought through how to best match each of those ground up definitions to a particular assessment. So we looked at kind of the typical assessment the environmental hazards literature would use. We looked at the changes in how the factors were constructed across decades. We looked at within census tracts whether there was a general increase or decrease in vulnerability over time, how well fit that line was to the data as a sign for how transient the place was, and then whether the overall categorization changed between decades to identify persistent forms of vulnerability. So many of these had appeared in the environmental hazards literature. The transient and persistent forms of social vulnerability were new metrics we developed. And you can see, without going into too much detail, that these highlight different areas. So in each map, the red areas are the most vulnerable areas around Milwaukee and the water, and the areas where there's high transience or place-based vulnerability are different than the others, with the downtown remaining most persistently vulnerable across all maps. So that tells, in relation to environmental justice and sustainability, I think this is an important tool for watershed groups that observe themselves to not be particularly diverse, are interested in diversity, but don't yet have the tools to engage more broadly. So first, the interview analysis suggests that just go to work with some social service agencies. They might be able to help you understand the limitations of your own viewpoint and suggest some ways that you could slightly shift the way you're framing your priorities in order to meet goals that are common to both watershed groups and people who don't necessarily identify environmental priorities as highest. In the interview set, we also saw competing views about whether environmental protection was the foundation, the cornerstone of equity and improvement to people's lives, or if it was a capstone and kind of like the highest, the least, what do they call it, like highest on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think one person said. Those are pretty different viewpoints. So if your watershed group is assuming vulnerable groups are not interested in participating because they have too many other things to deal with, you might want to just remember check that assumption before you move forward with it. The last example is about dead grass in Phoenix, and really came about with the foreclosure crisis in 2008 led to widespread foreclosure across a number of cities, mostly in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt for very different reasons, but both underlined by subprime lending, which disproportionately targeted low-income communities and communities of color. So we see generally higher rates there, but fairly high rates of foreclosure everywhere. And we were interested in a few different things. One was just, is foreclosure leading to change on properties during the foreclosure event? Is it leading to larger scale change in the urban environment? And is there evidence that other social forces and social norms, maybe at a neighborhood level, might be filling in? So the first thing we wanted to do was understand whether we could detect a signal of foreclosure at all. And just to give you a sense for the scope of foreclosure in Phoenix, this is an animation of all new foreclosure filings from 2002 to 2012. So we're in year 2005 now, still pre-foreclosure, high growth. Then we're getting into it, 2007, 2008. 2009, I'm doing a survey, getting lots of undeliverables. 2010, I'm gone. 2012, I'm at Illinois trying to convince people they need to solve my grudge match against Phoenix and undeliverable service. You can see changes. So the red areas here are the grassier or greener areas in the desert. There's over the same time period. So you can see a little bit that the city or the metropolitan area is growing out, and you can't see at this resolution anyway much about what's going on within the boundaries. One of the problems is, or for analysis, is that a pixel is bigger than a yard usually. So we needed to know if we could pick out foreclosure in pixels. So I don't know why I put this one here, but this is the overall data structure. I think this version of how we put the data together is the funniest because it's got the faces of the data providers. I don't know why Michael did that, but anyway. So we combined from the county parcel and residential data. We also added in some census data. Foreclosure data is publicly available, but it's very messy, and so it's also very economically viable to put it together. So we found this information market that had good records for the Phoenix metro area. They charged hourly, so getting them to just dump all their data was not that expensive. And we were able to join that and then do some comparisons with the Landsat images. So to first make sure we could detect foreclosure and that and that grass sometimes was dying with foreclosure, we used a differences approach. The postdoc I hired, Michael Min, did a lot of this work, and you can see in this image here a difference on this very large lot between when it was green and owned, and then after its foreclosure and all the grass died. So they stopped watering it, as you would expect in a desert city. It died. And you can see that reflected here. So the gray line is the median greenness for anything nearby, and we have a much greener tract than than the median for the neighborhood before the foreclosure event, and then it collapses down closer to the median after. To test whether or not it was always vegetation change and not something else going on, like shifts in the boundaries of the pixels or somebody putting in a new garage, changing the reflectance there, Michael did a blinded study with undergraduate data entry specialists where he randomly assigned them some portion of point and asked them to look before and after a date he specified and tell them whether, and using Google Earth to tell him whether they could see a vegetation change over time. So some of those were foreclosed, some of them were not. We found that generally there wasn't always vegetation change associated with a foreclosure event, but if there was an NDVI change, it was associated with grass dying and not other events. This is where Josh Randall comes in, and Josh Gray. And so we got to the point where we thought, okay, so we know there's some kind of impact on foreclosure. We know that it's spatially variable and uneven. We know that vegetation cover across multiple cities is spatially uneven and varies with a bunch of demographic and built environmental characteristics. So would we expect that change in greenness as a slightly different measure, so once vegetation is established, whether it's getting green over time or getting brown over time, to vary with these same things, and would we expect to see a signal at a neighborhood level associated with foreclosure? So this preliminary analysis shows that the things you normally expect to predict vegetation in cities comes out as pretty important, but foreclosure is also there on... Sorry, I got too close to them. Did I do that? No. Oh.
It's a zombie alert.
Yeah, right. I knew it!
I had to stop.
So this project is ongoing. We're happy to have Josh Randall working with Yellen and I and enrolled in Josh Gray's class where he has to have a data set to do data mining so that we can finish this out, because I think there's a common, well, maybe it's not that common, but it seems like there's kind of a general idea that more green is always better. And in Phoenix, we might find that if it's not better, it's at least associated with more affluence and certainly higher levels of consumption. So we can think about that both from a sustainability perspective in terms of what sorts of habitat is it providing for what animals and birds. Birds are animals. Just checking your wildlife class, see if they're paying attention. What sort of habitat is it providing? But we can also examine the spatial unevenness of recovery. So are we seeing quicker recoveries or transitions to alternative states in neighborhoods with some characteristics and not others, and then look for the underlying processes that might explain that. We haven't done a lot of this groundwork in Phoenix. We have a graduate student finishing up still at Illinois, and she's doing a lot of very similar work in Cleveland, where the vegetation goes wild under foreclosure or the houses come down, and where people are actively using nuisance property laws to take big banks to task in neighborhoods that are largely neglected. So that's a kind of a different slice through the same problem, and I think it's going to yield really interesting results. So in summary, we have 3 different cases where geospatial approaches have been useful in terms of understanding environmental justice in different ways. And in none of the cases have we really used methods that were common to the initial framework of environmental justice. We're not just looking at the distribution of people and the distribution of hazards. We're looking at something a little bit more dynamic. We're incorporating change over time, and we're evaluating types of knowledge that may have been missing from more conventional approaches. And in that, I think we learn a couple of lessons. The first is that environmental narratives are complex and inherently political. So So the narrative of the garden, for example, illustrates not only the way the removal of the garden puts power dynamics on play, but the way even something that's seemingly as unbiased as soil testing can play into that. So that makes environmental challenges justice challenges because they have the potential to reinscribe injustices if we proceed with kind of a status quo approach. Therefore, there's a need to re-examine our scientific practices in order to understand the way the problem is framed and whether that itself engenders bias. So are we, by claiming a neutral stance, are we in fact doing harm to communities that have been traditionally left out of decision-making and conversations because of overt discrimination or other systemic forms of marginalization? And that seems especially relevant when we think even about the idea of diversity and inclusion in our sciences, right? So if we're doing ecology, but some of the early ecology itself was set up to privilege a white way of knowing and understanding the world, then we need to rethink the way we create knowledge and what kind of knowledge is valued. And that's really kind of what's exciting to me about thinking differently about partnerships and what we produce as scientists. So I've written about this with colleagues in a number of different settings, but this particular paper is about weaving. We use a weaving metaphor. And with the idea that universities are set up to be pretty good partners for other really big institutions. But it's very difficult for the university to get its head around being a partner with a small NGO. Like, the amount of risk management paperwork we had to do to lead test in urban yards was insane. But if we had just gone out to like a cattle ranch, nothing. Like, we could do the same research there. So thinking about that and how that creates different tensions because things are going on at different scales, because people have different priorities and agendas, and the need to really take your time to build trust, to ask good questions that ultimately advance your science and allow you to do things you might not have thought to ask without input from people with local knowledge is really important. But also to acknowledge that what people want out of it is really different from what you want out of it. And I think that's where the idea that environmental justice is praxis, that it's both a scholarly enterprise and kind of field of scholarship, and that is connected to an explicit goal to improve equity for people that have historically been marginalized from environmental protection is important. And that's what I'm really interested in bringing to this as just on the cusp project, just beginning project on hurricane recovery. So thinking really differently about what comes out of research and how I interact with participants. So a couple of weeks ago, I went to the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Matthew to check out what was going on in the community, and I just set up a photo booth at their event because what they want is a chance to tell their stories and have that documented so they can pay it forward. And that's a pretty low-stakes thing for me to do. It's not directly data, but it's a product that I can give to them that also is ultimately going to fill in for the trust relationships that I need in order to do some community mapping and get people to participate in interviews later on. So this is where's the position? So related to hurricane recovery, there are claims like we're going to rebuild Lumberton or Houston better, bigger and better. But we need to think about what that really means. and whether it really means we're going to make Houston or Lumberton or wherever it is whiter and more affluent, because those are not the same things. One is used to code for the other, but they do not need to be the same thing. And this, I think there's a place in this to uncover the complexity of relationships and social learning across landscapes in terms of how different levels of government relate to different parts of, say, a watershed, and whether the opportunities or stressors introduced by hurricane and hurricane recovery allow people to bring resources together that were separated before, or further disaggregate and confuse efforts toward any kind of progress. I think the objectives of research like this for me are about highlighting connections between social vulnerability communities and disaster recovery decision makers. We hear on the ground time and time again that disaster recovery specialists are really good at reaching really easy to reach people. Those aren't really the people that need the help or the people that were exposed to environmental burdens in the first place. And I'm still getting to know the North Carolina landscape in terms of who's doing really good work in this area, but I've been inspired to meet public health people at Eastern Carolina, community justice people. There's great people in the design school here doing hurricane recovery work, and the UNC Hurricane Matthew Disaster Recovery Initiative. And so it's an exciting time to be here, because I think that means there's opportunities not just to make connections across social sciences, but also to think about how within the College of Natural Resources we can use the knowledge about the natural system side to create environmental protection for all. So I don't have a lot to say about this project. The idea is that resilience really comes from diversity and engaging people across lines that they see as different, and that we can't do this through regular science, but we can advance regular science by doing this. And so things like capturing people's stories and figuring out a way for people who recovered from Hurricane Katrina to pay their knowledge forward to others is something that I'm really interested in, and I think that it has the capacity to integrate many different interests and strengths on this campus. I think I'll end there. I have lots of secret slides. If anybody has any questions or any ideas how to pursue hurricane research.
Thanks, Beth.
Comment or question. It occurs to me that the greenness thing you used on the dead grass could be used inversely to look at gentrification. Has anybody thought about it?
Are greener areas.
Like in Phoenix, are the greener areas, well, our place,
Right.
could you use that similar kind of analysis or tool to look at the opposite, not places that are foreclosure or causing degradation, but rather places that are gentrifying, because gentrification is also an environmental justice issue.
Right. I haven't thought about that. I'd have to think about what sort of indicator I would use, because the good thing about foreclosure is that you have a parcel level change you know about.
Yeah.
And gentrification is
Sure.
more of a community level of.
But you could look at property values. That would be something.
Yeah. Or changes in property values between sales or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd have to think about it more. Interestingly, you cannot use foreclosure sales price to do hedonic modeling because it's too wacky, because it's fixed and politicized and all sorts of things are going on.
So, this theme that you have about the environmental justice, it usually comes up when talk about the critical infrastructure services like power and water and even food across the landscape. And how would you think about approaching like when during a power outage or water system outage? People often complain that the people who get the power or water first are the rich people. So how would you approach this kind of a problem, like taking the alternative way of thinking about this and applying to that field? Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, how would I understand whether that was true or how to fix it? Because those are different problems.
Well, we would have to test to see if it's
Right.
true first.
Yeah.
We don't actually know. We think it might be, but we don't know.
I mean, I think you could probably see where the order that the grid gets restored and look at the demographics of the neighborhoods that are served by that.
Right? The data is not available.
But yeah, it must be somewhere because I know that if you put in your address, they can tell you if you have power back yet or not. So it's privately available, maybe.
Right.
Do you have it with your project?
I don't know, I don't think so.
Just
I don't know.
Just working on energy use with a group through the center, and they have access to private
Yeah.
household level energy data.
Remote sensing at night for lights.
Yeah, like they've been doing, like they've done all the imagery from Puerto Rico. I mean, for big outages, you could definitely use something like that to figure out where the order of restoration and what the characteristics of the community are. Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know if the tree cover would get in the way. It probably depends on the location. You could do it for some locations. Yeah.
So I recall from when I was in Arizona, there's lots of smart people working on vegetation industries that are not NDVI that work better with grassland systems. Have you looked at that or thought about other indices that might pick up grass signals, those like very low NDVI values a little bit better? Maybe even amplify them so you can pick up changes?
Nope.
I remember what they are.
Yeah, we talked about using EVI at some point earlier in the project, but I haven't really given it too much thought lately. Anyway, and I don't remember. I'm not the one looking at this from the perspective of a blade of grass. That is my collaborator, Jonathan Greenberg. That is a direct quote.
So that was really interesting. I had a question more at least on the environmental justice side, or the social justice side. You mentioned towards the end that as researchers, being neutral may do a disservice to communities that we serve or we're researching or we work for in a way. In what sense? Can you just elaborate it?
Yeah, so I guess if you work too hard to think that you are neutral, then you are buying into the dominant system, and that system may include some oppressive forces that you're not intentionally enacting in any sort of way. So it just kind of a call to examine that. And sometimes in research, it becomes really obvious that especially if you're doing conservation or sustainability or environmental justice or something that has an obvious normative societal implications, that you should examine how it fits in. And I'm not saying do less rigorous work or do work to prove the point of the oppressed people. Just think about how you carry out your work. So like our work in Milwaukee, we made videos. The videos are based on the interviews where people talked a lot about relationships between race and the environment. All the videos focus on different elements of ways that segregation influences environmental relationships in Milwaukee. We're getting ready to finish those videos, and there's massive violence very close to the sites where we've been doing the work because of a police shooting of a black man. So just in a very practical sense, that was not the right time to release a video because we're not experts and we're certainly not trying to re-traumatize people that might be experiencing tremendous personal or community levels of pain around those events. So so Caitlin needed to finish her thesis. So we figured out a way for her to write a thesis paper about why we needed to end there and what the next step should be. And then we talked to a lot more people in Milwaukee. So being outsiders from the community is also something to be considerate of, right? Like, we're not the ones that have to deal with the aftermath of releasing these videos in any way. So we talked to the outreach specialists that we've been working with. We talked to other people that were doing good work on water-related environmental justice. We talked to scholars from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee who do a lot of environmental justice work in order to figure out the right path forward. And for us, the path was to do a fourth video that kind of took the ideas from the first three and provided more context and explicitly focused on people having a conversation together. So we went back to Milwaukee in May, and by then, things were settled into some kind of new crazy normal that we're all living in. And we were able to kind of film that conversation, do a public launch of the other videos at the park that had been a strong partner in a lot of our work, and that felt a lot better. That also instituted a really good idea from one of the women that participated in the video to not just think of it as something for policy audiences that are considering water revitalization and gentrification pressures, but also to think of it as a educational tool for the good environmental education that's going on in the urban areas and potentially developing discussion guides around that. So that's something we're trying to finish up. Thanks. Good question. Long answers. Because there's so much more I wanted to put in here.
Other questions?